Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode in the Beezone series. And tonight in the studio, we have Dan Sleeth, who is a psychotherapist in Lake County, an author of many fine pieces of literature and books, and we are going to discuss some of his writings tonight. And I'd like to first introduce Dan to the viewers and the people of Beezone.
Nice to meet you.
Well, thank you for coming, and I really am excited about having you here and being able to talk about some of the work that you're doing, because I think it's extremely, if not only insightful, but important. Because what you do, what I think do very well, better than most writers that I know of, is that you integrate the psychological and the spiritual in a way that most people, and I'm not a student in the integral community, but in today's world, integral psychological model of Wilber and transpersonal work of earlier people before Wilber really is the forefront of psychology, which touches into spirituality. But today's world, spirituality is really mixed in with psychology. But from what I've seen in other writings, spirituality is still psychology. Huh?
Yes, I would agree. I guess from my point of view, the spirituality gets watered down into psychology. There are a number of therapists and psychologists who are theorists that are borrowing from especially Eastern spiritual non-dual traditions. Mindfulness is a very popular topic over the last 10-20 years that has done this, and they are intended to serve a psychological purpose, which is great. I'm in therapy, I use these same ideas, and they are very good for accomplishing a therapeutic process, but it's not the process of spiritual, transcendental awakening that they were intended to be. And even though a lot of well-meaning individuals speak in those terms, as this is an awakening, what is meant by that tends to be, as I say, watered down into more of a psychological context, framework. And it doesn't have the same meaning, but it is a fantastic reality to be a part of, that I would like to bring that back into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the key points that you work with in your writings that I see is the idea of ego. And one of the books that you wrote was called The Integral Ego. And you can find it on Amazon. It was published by American...
American University.
American University. And because the self, if you will, and ego are actually the same. One is used in a context of saying, talking in psychological jargon, and the other, ego, is used in a kind of spiritual, if you will, jargon. And then you bring Adida to the table. So maybe we should first talk about how does Adida influence your writing and your understanding?
Well, Adida is the whole reason for my writing. I don't know that I have much of a contribution to make except to be a spokesperson for Adida and to have his spiritual revelation be understood and rightly represented. Unfortunately, it's difficult for people who do not have a direct connection with a spiritual master to really appreciate the actual communication that they're making. So there's a lot of things said on behalf of Adida on the internet and among scholars and so forth that don't really represent what he is trying to communicate. So first and foremost, it's a kind of a setting the record straight sort of an effort, and at the same time build a bridge to all of these endeavors on the part of scholars and theorists and theologians to actually make a coherent statement that anybody can understand about the most profound matters of being and reality that have ever been uttered.
Right. And that's what I see today, is that there are lots of well-intentioned and very smart and educated people steeped in the traditions of psychological schools, steeped in the school of Indian esoteric philosophies, Western scientific thought, but they're still fragmented. They still have a piece of the puzzle where Adida and what you write has a unifying principle in this understanding. So, without getting too grandiose here, would it be accurate to say that there is a unifying principle or a unifying understanding in all of these various modalities?
Absolutely. That's the entire thrust of the work that I'm trying to do, is to bring that out and do it in a way that is accessible. And you don't have to be, a professor or somebody to appreciate it. And I think that's what Adida was trying to do as well. He wrote huge volumes of material in all kinds of different ways in an attempt to reach every single person, and has succeeded magnificently, I think. He has poetry, he has art, he has literature, as well as more of a technical revelation of his teaching word. So the idea, I think, is that every part of philosophy, spirituality, and psychology is grappling with a particular piece of this single picture.
Right.
And everybody has their affiliation, everybody has what they're familiar with, everybody knows what they know, but then they have limits. To get outside of the box of where your perspective or your affiliations are is one thing, and hugely important. But to actually get out of that box so that you incorporate all the other boxes, that's where it gets really tricky.
And so I guess this brings up the whole notion of ego, because this is where the boundaries begin and also end.
Indeed.
With this notion of ego, which in many different schools has lots of definitions, but Adida has a unique definition. And it's a kind of a verb more than a noun.
Indeed. That's exactly how he puts it. He says ego is not an entity, it's an activity. It's actually something taking place in the midst of the divine reality, or God, however you want to refer to it. And that activity has its effect and ultimately produces this manifest realm that we all live in, and produces each of the individuals who occupy that realm. And all the things that we do are invariably going to be guided by that gesture. And it's at every level of our being. So when you talk about integrating every point of view, there's the point of view of the deeper and divine aspects of ourselves that you'll find in spiritual traditions, and then there's the gross lower levels of ourselves that you'll find in all the psychological traditions, and they all fit together, but they are all, each and every one, in one way or another, foundationed in this egoic gesture of separation from God. And they represent not only that terrifying and agonizing recoil from the delightful love bliss of divine reality and the fearfulness of being apart, but also a drivenness to get back and to recover what the ego, the gesture of ego itself created.
Mm-hmm.
So you can never, on the basis of that egoic effort, overcome the ego, because the very attempt to do so reinforces the ego. And I think that is probably the crux of Adida's revelation.
So that's the old story of the guy stopping on a London country road asking, how can I get from where I am to some town? And the man says, you can't get there from here. The paradox that sits in everybody's soup, so to speak.
Mm.
But that sense of separation or the creation of ego is a continual and spontaneous and unifying principle.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong.
I'll have to do a little editing there. Okay. So, that principle of egoity, which then brings us to the three levels that you're referring to, or you didn't talk about the middle one, but the causal, the subtle, and the gross. Maybe we could talk a little bit about when you said the three, where you were implying about the three egos.
Mm-hmm.
All, no matter how high up the chain of subtle levels of consciousness, there's always this sense of separation.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly how it happens. Once that ego appears, that gesture of contraction, Adida likes to use the closed fist as a symbol for that. It's a kind of a grip or a spasm that takes place. Once that happens, then these levels all come into being, arising in the divine context of that gesture. And at the causal level, it's still an extraordinary divine state that gets referred to in the traditions of mankind, of humankind, as an utterly exquisite state of love bliss. Even though there is that tiniest trace of egoity in it that is separate, that has separated itself out. In the way that I'm putting it in the work that I've written, it separates out into two parts. One is awareness, one is love bliss. In the traditions, this is known as Satchitananda. And it is that's when the self-consciousness of the ego comes into play, where love bliss becomes related to awareness, awareness becomes related to love bliss, what Adida calls the illusion of relatedness. In reality, there isn't any of that separation.
So this is where the witness gets caught in the witnessing of himself, herself, itself, and just feeling that this is all there is, but yet there's still the subtle reflection of that ego.
Exactly, and that is in my mind, one of the most tricky elements of all the, to put it lightly, of all the approaches to spirituality that there are, because it can seem that this witnessing is, and is referred to as an enlightened state of being, which it is. Yet, if it does have that self-referring quality to it, then the ego is present, you're separate from the divine, and that is still suffering. Mm-hmm. And you're still in the obligatory position of trying to overcome that by, traditionally, by holding off the manifest realm and not being sullied by all
Being
that.
withdrawn into that.
Into that abstract, what some people might refer to as an abstract position of being cut off. So even at the most lofty, illustrious levels of a causal sage, that little bit of egoity still is marring the picture.
Mm-hmm. One of the pieces of work that I've seen you read of your work is has to do with Christianity. So, were you raised a Christian? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was raised a Christian. I kind of have to remember now. I think it was a Presbyterian Protestant, actually, and it was in the household where my father actually was an agnostic, and so we didn't have anything really foisted on us except that generalized expectation that somewhere along the line we'd settle in to the common folkways of our family and our society and be a good God-fearing Christian somewhere along the line. But I could never take it seriously.
But you seem to have a very good understanding of the Christian theology or the doctrines of Christianity and the Bible. So were you a student of the Bible in any way?
Well, the thing of it is, I couldn't take seriously some of the ideas presented in this particular spiritual tradition. But that isn't to say that there weren't many ideas that I embraced that I found utterly compelling as spiritual revelation. So I didn't have any formal training, but I, all throughout my life, have been committed since a child to truth. Mm-hmm. It's kind of an amazing thing in my view, because none of my friends were. Certainly none of my relatives were, and they were more than willing to believe in my mind fabrications that made them feel better.
So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Spokane, Washington, not far from the Idaho border, at the very edge of the Rockies.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that you bring out in your Christian writing is, I think, the stone in the shoe of any Christian and the all-loving God that is said to be, is the question of evil, or why do bad things happen to good people? And this notion of suffering, and why do all this suffering happens to good people? And this is never really fully, it's kind of explained in kind of general terms, but it's still left unresolved because evidence shows that a tsunami can wipe out in a day or kill thousands upon thousands and tens of thousands of people without any, where's God in that? So you touch on that in a way that I thought was very, 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 very good. So how does Adida work with that? How does Adida square the evil or the sin or the devil in the, how does he work with that unexplainable part of Christianity that still doesn't help out anybody?
Well, the issue, it seems to me, is around creation. I think that's the touchstone between Adida's revelation and the tradition of Christianity and the tradition of Judaism and Islam, for that matter, since they share similar views on creation, as well as Eastern traditions that have that same idea, is that, following up on our earlier commentary on the causal level, at that juncture, once that causal level is in place, creation is what happens. And all this manifest existence comes into being, but it's thoroughly impregnated with egoity. And that is something that you will not find in these spiritual traditions, because this is supposed to be a loving, benevolent gesture on the part of God
Mhm.
to bring forth the human beings, sometimes said explicitly for the sake of love having an opportunity to be expressed by God towards his creations and his creations towards God, and that this creates an opportunity for love to manifest. Yet it's coming out of this egoic state, so it's already in a condition of separation from God. So the oh, well, I guess that's how I would answer.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the other aspects that Adida Adida, although is not separated out from the traditional understandings, whether it be Christian or Hindu or Buddhist or any other traditions, he's, as I understand Adida's writing, has a completed aspect to it all. He's filled in the fullness of these traditions.
Mm.
And where we see the world today is in tribal conflicts grown to a national level. Religious conflicts going to the extremes, political ideas holding to ideology and not compromise. Everything is held out to these fringes of their positions, the separation. So one of the things that I've always understood about Adida, he says identification, differentiation, and desire. This atomic split in the creation of ego. But in psychological terms, there's mind, there's mind forms, I see a world out there, but really I'm seeing an image, right? Maybe could you explain a little bit to the audience about the image and the mind form, the other, the self and the other, the split that creates, the vision that creates the finger pointing, the other, this, that, the other stuff?
Well, the way I approach that in in the writing I've done is to compare it to a TV set. It's not so different that what we sit here watching, we take seriously as three-dimensional beings that we're interacting with. But it's really more like images on a screen, like a TV screen. And we supply the three-dimensionality in the way in which we interpret the perceptual and sensory experience that is itself being generated at an even deeper level of mind that is at the causal level of creation. So all of which is arising in consciousness as a, in the way that I put it, an impact by awareness with love bliss to the two sides of the divine self. There is a kind of, as you say, that the identification, differentiation, and desire, when you have that separation, you are differentiated from God into the two aspects of God, love and awareness, and you have no choice at that level but to work with what you have at hand, the materials at hand. So awareness can only be aware, but it can focus awareness into attention. And I think that is one of the unique aspects of Adida's revelation, is where he puts such an emphasis on the egoic activity of attention. And that coming to a point creates attention, a tension at the tip of attention.
Right.
And there is some sort of impact with love bliss. It affects love bliss. And love bliss itself explodes, or just unfurls all of these experiential, perceptual experiences that come out and that get made by mind into the three-dimensional objects that we ultimately come to consider our world.
That, I don't know if you got it all, but that's a mouthful right there. If you have an image of what he was just speaking about, that was the creation in itself, and the creation of mind, but faulty mind of fractures, of mind of the world of 10,000 things. Because the point at which Adida and you are addressing in all of this is a unifying principle where the separate one is not viewing anything other than oneself, his self, her self, its self. So there's the capitalization in one of your writings that it's not us, it's us with a capital U.
And with quotes.
Under quotes, right. Because there's nobody there putting the metal on oneself for one's realization. It's only by the disappearance of the illusion of the ego. And that's why the ego is really the beginning, the middle, and the end of all of this discussion about spirituality, psychology, and everything else that throws out the world to something way out there, and then you work with it in a mechanical fashion. But your basic asana is fear in all of that, and that's why we're in the situation, the condition we're in that way.
True.
So
if I might, since you're talking about this theme of unification, and there is an integral community that is very invested in exploring that unification, it's important, I have found, in my own attempts to grasp what Adida is saying about non-dual reality. He uses a term called prior unity. And I have found that to be the most befuddling juxtaposition of words that I can even imagine. In our egoic position, everything is seen as something we must create, that we must achieve, or we must attain. Us doing something. And the idea that reality is already unified. There is no union to achieve or to accomplish. It's already that state. It's just contrary to anything that the ego is about. And no matter how you come at it from an egoic position, it's going to be confusing, offensive, contrary to your most heartfelt desire. Because no matter what it is that you really want, you're never going to get it.
well, that's why it's so difficult for people to get it fully, because it's actually threatening.
It is threatening.
Because what it does is it challenges the most sacred parts of whatever the sacred worshiping elements of your life are.
That's exactly right. And all the spiritual traditions, all the religious affiliations that people have, and psychological affiliations, the psychological wars aren't any less heartfelt than religious wars, where everybody's fighting for their piece of the pie. And you mentioned this earlier about egoic society being inherently at odds. Adida tries to point that out, especially in a book he calls Not Two is Peace, which is his offering to the world as full of helpful guidance on how the world can get past these tribal affiliations and exist as everybody all at once,
Mhm.
which we already are. It's an already existing state. If you're in these tribal positions and you're committed to your egoic preservation and the fulfillment of your desire, sooner or later you're coming up against somebody else's limits, inevitably.
Well, this is what you're seeing in the Middle East.
Exactly.
Exactly. This is played out in real world time.
And on our shores, unfortunately.
Yeah, now it's brought into our world more and more, because we were asleep at the wheel until 9/11, where we never had any attack.
And that's why I find this to be so timely, so important. This is not a lofty, rarefied domain. This is of utter crucial importance to everybody in their day-to-day ordinary lives. We have got to find a way to bridge these walls and separate acts and get past and into a evolution of consciousness, if you will, a maturation of our culture and our civilization, so that we can embrace all of these other members of everybody all at once,
Without feeling threatened.
without being threatened, and in the context of prior unity, where nothing is threatened.
Right. So the full expression of whatever tradition you're in, you can fully express that, but yet you're in a larger field that is even before any division, separation, or exclusion from what is already prior. I wanted to bring up a little bit of the psychological work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings up Adida's work within the 7 stages of life. And since most people are within the first 3 stages of life, and he brings that egoic conflict, as it shows itself in developmental psychology, has to do with dependence, childishness, and independence of adolescence,
Mm-hmm.
or the development of individuation, which is a necessary and healthy and required course of development in just a healthy individual. So in the lofty ideas of the causal and the subtle and the going down into the earth realm here,
Uh-huh.
speak a little bit about the conflict in the first 3 stages of life, which shows itself in these kinds of childish notions of God or independent notions of God in the adolescence. Could you speak a little bit about this notion in developmental terms of the childish independence, the childish dependence, and the adolescent independence? That kind of...
Well, I think a very interesting part of the psychology of all this is the infant comes into the world, this utterly innocent being. Yet it is bringing as baggage all of these prior states of deeper personality. Yet, almost immediately, we start as an infant to become unconscious of all that and start developing our lower self mental capacities. We develop perspective, we develop identity, these things take over, become the filter through which we interact with our worlds. So when we come in, it's 100% dependent. It's 100% in this mode of what I call autistic love. And autistic love doesn't mean the psychological state that people might be familiar with, like on movies such as Rain Man or anything else you might have seen. It simply means this state of being imploded on yourself, all about me. And that autistic love is how we love as an infant. And we have to learn empathetic love. Empathetic love is all about you, the other person. So at the very beginning of life, we're locked into this duality of self and other. We're already in this egoic position, grappling with what I want over against what other people want, and having to find some integral resolution, and that's how growth and maturation develops stage by stage into what I call integral love. And in the beginning, that conflict between the two, it expresses itself, the way Adida puts it, as a intense confrontation with separation, primarily in the infant's experience from the mother. And the mother, all the nurturing and nourishing that the mother does. Now, that separation that began at the very beginning with the ego separating from God, trickling all the way down into this birth, is still there manifesting itself from the very get-go. So the infant has no choice but to resolve that somehow, and the way in which it's understood in psychological terms is through attachment. Well, the dependency is now thoroughly established. You are dependent on, in all your relations, all manifest that dependency, that you're dependent on your mothering person. So there has to be a integration of those two sides at every step. So the whole context of that those first 6 to 7 years, which Adida calls the first stage of life, there is an infancy, a toddler, a preschooler stage. Each one has to grapple with its own issues, but it's all of it in the context of that dependency. And it's all in the context of establishing your individuation as a separate being, apart and separate from the mothering one, which can only be done if you do this little bit of attachment and a few other developmental tasks along the way. When you enter into the second 7 years, the second stage of life, as Adida puts it, you now have to focus on the socializing part. And there are all kinds of issues around that too, needless to say. It even begins in that first stage in toddlerhood, what we call the terrible twos, where you've got that banging together of the parent and the child. So it is a complex process taking place over many years, and many developmental tasks have to be accomplished. But when you hit the third stage of life, all of it has to be integrated. And Adida refers to the third stage of life, the third set of 7 years, as integration. That's the business of the third stage of life. Even though you are doing integration all along, this is where it becomes critical. And I think this is where it becomes very important to the integral community, who talks so much about, in the maturation of human beings contemporarily, integral thinking becomes the way in which human beings look at their lives and how they get along in the world. It's there from the beginning, but it comes into its own at the maturation of the third stage of life in adolescence. And then the independence that you mentioned and the dependence of childhood have to come together and each have its legitimate and honorable piece of this bigger picture.
And if these earlier stages aren't fully adapted to and then transcended, if my understanding is correct, even though life goes on to the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, many people who appear to be adults walking down the street are developmentally in a very early stage of their psychological development.
And this is probably the crux of the treatment that I do with my clients. I always have that very conversation with every client. I tell them that having an inner child is not a cute way of talking. It's the literal truth. What was your child still exists. And not just in your memory, although obviously that's a huge component, but also the very bodily life that where you take joy in life and you're spontaneous and creative and curious and enjoy life is still ongoing as well. But unfortunately, traumas happen in every life, and how bad the trauma was and how prepared you were to absorb that trauma together indicate exactly where you might get stuck in that developmental stage, and then carry, or better said, get stuck, or I mean stunted. Then that becomes the quality of the perspective or identity that you carry forward in life, and you live like a child, even in an adult body, even though you have the capacity to do adult functions like hold down a job or raise a family.
And the key in all of this is the reaction to what you might say is trauma or an incident or a moment where the child withdraws and refuses to be in connection to that source. The sense of, you don't love me, you withdraw, and then you blame, because there are incidences which appear rather traumatic for many people, but the fundamental principle or responsibility of the psyche or the individual is that there is a movement away from the authority, the power, the source as the child develops. There's and then the pattern kind of starts from there, but there's this you don't love me principle.
That's a very common way to put it in the psychological theory. Everything the child does, because it's a dependent being, is in relation to significant others, and every developmental task that gets resolved is done in that context, and there's always going to be a self-other duality that gets put into the perspective and the identity of a child. And at each level, it'll be more sophisticated, it'll be more highly functional, and it'll be more appropriate, and an individual will be more successful. What Adi Da offers to this conversation, I think, is that he points out the exact effort and gesture is already in play between you and God and divine reality, where you've made the same withholding, distancing, taking that position, and then trying to work out happiness on the basis of the suffering that creates. It's a futile effort. Even though you can become successful, functional in this world, underneath it is still going to be that underlying egoic futility.
This is where you always hear people with lots of money telling you who don't have money, people who don't have money, money's not where it's at. Money cannot buy happiness. And so people with these elements that we who don't have it want it because we think we're going to get it, and the people who get it tell you that that's not it, but yet there's this kind of, I still think it's that. It's interesting. But I want to go back to your writing, and I really do want to recommend people to look at some of Dan's work. Although it's a little bit scholarly for this old man.
I hear that a lot.
I got to tell you, if you're in the integral community and do have a predisposition for really discursive thinking in a very academic, but also he brings home a lot of basic kind of concepts. I think you'll find it very interesting if you want to pursue more. So I want to ask you now about, what are you working on now?
So the book I'm working on is called Unholy Genesis. As I mentioned earlier, creation to me seems like the perfect touchstone between all of the spiritual traditions on non-dualism, including Adida, and all the traditions of Christianity and Judaism and Islam, all three, I think, can be bridged by this way of looking at creation. If it's seen in the context of prior unity, then not only does it allow for this bridge to take place, but it also creates a possibility for every version of spiritual and psychological orientations to what makes up the human being. There's a way to bring them all into the same fold.
No small feat.
No.
So the title, Unholy Genesis.
Indeed.
Genesis being the book of the Torah, the Bible, and the Old Testament,
Yes?
and unholy meaning,
Well, in this case, what I mean by unholy, I'm referring to the dilemma that every individual, at least in English-speaking or Christian countries certainly, is familiar with, is how can so much evil exist in a world created by an all-loving, all-powerful God? And there simply is no answer in the Christian or a Judaic or Islam faith as to how that happened except faith.
they try to explain it in some ways, like there's lessons here and there's going to be lessons, but they don't fully really give you a heart answer that does completely give you an answer. Gives you rationalizations, gives you kind of childish fairy tale stuff, but never really resolves the problem.
The piece I think that is missing is how egoity and evil come into play in creation. The idea is that creation is a good thing, that it's done by a loving, benevolent Father, when in fact egoity and the whole process that we've been discussing, in which suffering actually is the outcome, that is what gets put into play at the point of creation. So there is no reconciling those two sides.
Right.
And any attempt to do so is ultimately going to be seen through by any thoughtful person, I believe, and that it can't possibly add up. You still are left with an all-powerful, all-loving God and evil, and what's up with that? And in my mind, that makes it unholy.
Right. So if people wanted to find you on the internet, aside from the Beezone, where would they find you?
Well, I do have a website, dbsleeth.com.
dbsleeth, SLEETH.com.
And that's what I have on the internet at this point. I also, my publications, I have a couple books that can be found on Amazon.com, of course. And anything else, what also might be of interest, I should say, would be any of the work by Adida. Anything that I'm writing is an attempt to make his work known, so you can find Adida through adidam.org, or an excellent website for anyone that wants a very simple introduction is consciousnessitself.com.
Consciousnessitself.com. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this talk and interview and conversation with Dan Sleeth and myself, Ed Reether of the Beezone. And if I'm lucky enough, I'm going to get Dan back here in front of the camera to talk some more. So if you stay tuned, hopefully we'll see you again. And thank you again for watching and listening, and we'll see you again soon. Bye. Thank you.
Yes.